What is going on, Krutons and Nutons? It is me, Wonton. This video is actually going to be a new kind of video that we are going to be trying out. It is going to be a meta-analysis breakdown video. In terms of this video in particular, we are going to be covering the meta-analysis breakdown that was seen at Anime Expo during the first ever World Qualifier tournament, where we actually got to see the first ever aspect of competitive play for Bakugan. So might as well get into it. So in terms of what this video is going to be covering, it's going to be covering a lot of varying aspects of the tournament itself, where it's going to cover the decks that were played, the factions that were selected, along with the Bakugan teams. So we're going to break down each of them bit by bit and see what the meta kind of looks like, starting off with the factions. So with the faction breakdown, I do have a pie chart right here, as I'm going to shrink myself down. The pie chart shows that the overall selection of factions in terms of what each player used for their decks is actually rather spread out, with the exception of two. The most popular factions as of right now being Pyrus and Darkus, being at 12 each, closely followed by the Aquas and Aurelus, Aquas and Aurelus being at 10 each, and then followed third by Chaos at 7 and Ventus at 5. So with this selection, some of it did surprise me quite a bit. Not so much with Pyrus and Darkus, but more so with Chaos. Chaos being at 7. So with Chaos' playstyle, it is very minimalistic, where you don't have to commit too much to the deck or the cards in order to get a solid boost in B power. As for the lack of Ventus, that is going to be very standard, considering the fact that right now Ventus doesn't have too many strong frontline cards where Ventus is going to be the main player of the deck. They does have a couple of decent cards, but it's more used as a support type of faction compared to the others. It's not really frontline. So with the top 4 factions that were played, Pyrus, Darkus, Aquas, and Aurelus, it is actually not too surprising that they were the top 4 most played factions. With Pyrus and Darkus, they are actually very solid in terms of what they do, especially when it comes to their evolutions. They have very solid stats and solid damage ratings. But not only that, their manipulations of their decks along with their opponent's decks, or at least their opponent's playstyles, does give solid reasoning to their choices, with Pyrus getting rid of cores, while with Darkus, if paired with the right faction such as Pyrus, it can activate certain abilities with its discarding ability, or discard the opponent's cards, basically manipulating their hand. As for Aquas, Aquas again is a very solid choice in the fact that it can do a lot of combos, where it can play back-to-back cards, making sure that it outpaces the opponent, along with by comboing, it can activate additional effects that would not normally be seen from the other factions. But aside from that, guys, that's going to be it when it comes to the faction analysis. We're going to move on to the deck analysis now, in terms of what decks were played. So, as you see from the bar chart below, we do see a rather spread out meta in terms of what was seen at Anime Expo. However, there are going to be some decks, as you can obviously tell from the graph chart, that are more popular than others. The one that stands out the most, obviously, is going to be Darkest Fury. Darkest Fury is a very solid deck that came into light recently due to the release of Bakugan Resurgence. Mostly due to the fact of one card in particular being Titan Tertonium, Darkest to be specific, where if the card is played, you discard your entire hand, which in this case activates Fury. Fury being that if you have no cards in your hand, the Fury ability activates. Originally, Fury in terms of Bakugan Battle Brawlers was not that great in terms of the abilities. There was really no way to facilitate Fury, along with the fact that a lot of the Fury cards at the time were very lackluster. But with the introduction of Bakugan Resurgence, that has come to a complete 180, where Fury has become one of the more dominating decks, at least in the Anime Expo meta. 3 of them were the same in that they were the mid-range Darkest Fury decks, being comprised of the teams of Darkest Tertonium, as we mentioned, Pyrus Serpentes, and Pyrus Hellcore. Pyrus Hellcore being one of the newest to the Fury line of Pyrus Bakugan, where its hyper form is a 5 energy, 1500 B, and 5 damage. But if it is activating in Fury, where you have no cards in hand, you get an additional 10 damage on top of it. So making it a total of 15 damage, not including any cores that it picks up or any sort of action card augmentation to its damage. Serpentines we've already seen, where it's 510, and then if it's in Fury, it gets an additional 1000 B. And then because the Dark Tritonium, just play it, discard your entire hand, Fury activates automatically. You don't even have to have Tritonium in battle to play it. That way you can activate the Fury. In terms of how this deck performed within the tournament itself, one variant did get to the finals, the top two. This one being the more aggressive variant, being comprised of Darkus Hydrus, Aurus Nilius, and then Pyrus Serpentes. With this one is a little bit more aggressive in the fact that the evolutions were a lot easier to pull off and not have to wait so far late into the game in order to pull off the plays that were necessary to activate Fury. So this deck is definitely something to look out for in future games and the future meta, because of the way that it can kind of surprise a lot of players with how it can just do a come from behind victory, especially with the core selection and the cards that it has to choose from, such as Dark Fortune, Dan, Air Zero, Super Fuel, a lot of cards that they have at their disposal that are very strong to make the deck easily one of the top decks out there. So, with the second most played decks out there, one of which is going to be the ATDU deck and the Green Fist deck. For those of you that don't know, ATDU stands for Aurelus Titan Dragonoid Ultra. Aurelus Titan Dragonoid Ultra, for those of you that don't know, is an evolution of Aurelus Dragonoid Ultra, where it counts as all factions, being a 4 energy cost, 1200 B, and 10 damage. The all factions is actually the most important aspect of this card, in the sense that when it comes to the flip cards. With the traditional used flip cards, they stop everything that is not a specific faction. So for example, let's say Pact of Darkness, because everyone knows Pact of Darkness, it stops all damage from a non-Darkest Bakugan. But because Aurelus Titan Dragonoid counts as Darkest, it gets completely past that ruling where it's like, oh, you say no Darkest, I'm also Darkest. So I'm just going to keep barging on through with the 10 damage that I have. When it comes to how Aurelus Titan Dragonoid is played, it is normally the last Bakugan to initiate the team attack, normally averaging out to around 30 damage overall, basically making it a very, very difficult attack to stop, unless you have a very specific kind of flip card, being either the new flip cards where it stops core specific holding Bakugan, or a faction specific flip card where it stops a specific faction, which does stop Aurelus Titan Dragonoid. With the Green Fist decks, the other second most popular played deck, there were 3 different variants to the decks. All 3 decks were a little bit similar to each other in terms of the factions that were used, but they were also very different in terms of the teams that were selected in terms of play. With 2 of them, they did have 2 of the same Bakugan utilizing Aurelus Pegatrix and Chaos Pegatrix, but the difference where they kind of separated was that one used Aurelus Fangzor and the other, or Aquas Fangzor, sorry, and the other used Aquas Krikelios. Most likely due to the fact that Aquas Fangzor's evolution, anytime you play it, you do get to draw 3 additional cards from your deck to kind of facilitate more plays, or at least keep your hand rather full in case you're running low on cards. So that was definitely a smart approach behind it, but I'm not sure if it worked out in the end. With Green Fist decks overall, they are very balanced in terms of trying to get the B power and the damage rating to a very high consistent level. The third variant of the deck did add an additional faction that wasn't Aurelus. In this case, it was Ventus, comprised of Ventus Serpentes, Aquas Serpentes, and Chaos Pegatrix. The shield deck goes along a very similar premise to the Green Fist deck, where you make a team comprised mostly of shield cores. That way you can use those cores to your advantage, particularly the ones that give plus 400 to a very specific faction. Those are the ones that a lot of people are leaning towards when creating a shield-based deck. During the qualifier, there were 2 different variants of the shield deck. One going with the traditional route, being played with Aquas and Darkest. This other one instead used Aurelus in it as well, in this case Aurelus Trox. So with the selection of Aurelus Trox, the base form is actually not that great in the sense that it has a base power of 300 and a damage rating of 5. So damage rating is a little bit on the average par, while the B power is rather low. However, that is not something that we should be looking at. We should actually be looking at the abilities of the Bakugan itself, where if any action has been played on that card or on that Bakugan, it gets an additional 100 B and 2 damage. With that Aquas supporting it, it can get to a rather high amount of damage and high amount of B power, not including the evolution of Aurelus Trox being its hyper form, Hyper Trox, which is a 2-cost evolution at 600 B and 6 damage. So with that amount, it actually goes into a much more sustainable stat where it's not too difficult to outpace the opponent, especially with its ability. It has a very similar ability with its base form, where anytime you play an action on it, it gets an additional B power and damage. With this hyper form, it gets a total of 300 B and 4 damage for each action is played on. So for example, if you just happen to play 2 action cards on it, it goes from 600 to 1200 B in just 2 cards, and going from 6 damage to 14 damage, making it very difficult to kind of play catch up if you aren't playing a deck that involves a lot of B power gainage. As for the other shield variant, the focus on the deck was more based on B power, utilizing the flow mechanic. It comprised of Aquas Pegatrix, Aquas Mantinoid, and Darkus Nihilus Ultra. So with that team lineup, it focused a lot on B power, with Pegatrix and Nihilus actually getting a lot of bonuses if it lands on a shield core. With Mantinoid, there isn't any sort of benefit that it gets when landing on a shield core. However, with its evolution, its ability, it's able to switch the Baku cores that it is holding with the opponent. So if the opponent's holding a very strong and beneficial core, the Mantinoid is like, oh, you have a very solid core, I have an okay core, I'm just going to give you my okay core and then take your really good core. That way I can win that battle, making sure that the B power is always superior to that of the opponent. It's very straightforward in terms of how the deck was built. As we move on to the Mono Darkus deck, one of the Mono Darkus decks I wasn't able to get with the one that did play in the qualifier that I did get information on. That was played by Jet Kuso of Darkus Mantinoid Ultra, Darkus Tertonium Ultra, and Darkus Nihilus Ultra. With that deck, it focused a lot on the discarding aspect of the Darkus faction. So either by discarding the opponent's cards or discarding his own cards through the use of the sacrifice mechanic, which is the discard mechanic for Darkus. The combination of with Mantinoid, Titan Mantinoid, if you look at the special ability in particular of Titan Mantinoid, where it gets plus 400 for every card that you've discarded, this actually works rather well with the team lineup that Jet has produced, utilizing the Titan Tertonium Ultra. From there, however many cards he discards, he gets an additional plus 400 for each card discarded, most likely helping him win that battle. What's up, Krutons and Nutons? It's me, Wonton. So this video actually ran a little bit longer than I had hoped after going through all the footage, because I'm trying to keep all the important information on there. So yeah, if you guys want to continue on to part 2 of the Anime Expo meta-analysis, there's going to be a link down below or some sort of video box near my face. Either or, I'm not really sure. But yeah, so hopefully I see you guys in part 2, or rather you guys see me, because I can't really see you watching me. But yeah, anyway, hope you guys enjoyed that. Share, subscribe, all that stuff. And yeah, hopefully you guys watch part 2.